a few minutes and our attendees are still arriving. So we will give it another couple of minutes, and then we will start Mark's presentation. Again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Tonight's lecture will be presented in a webinar format, which means that we can't see or hear you, but you can see and hear us. And you may ask your questions in the chat section at the bottom of the screen, or through the Q&A section, again, at the bottom of your screen, whichever way you are more comfortable with. You may also share your experiences with your fellow attendees through the chat. We will present this lecture exactly the same way as Mark presented previous lectures. He will, start a presentation, and in about 20 minutes from the start, he'll pause for any possible questions. So please don't hesitate. If you would like to ask your questions live, you may use the raise your hand feature, and I will be able to unmute you temporarily, or you can just type your question in the chat box or Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So at this point, we are at 7:01, and okay. So right now, I think that we're all set, Mark, to start the lecture, and please take it away. And please, everyone, welcome and enjoy.
Thanks, Kate. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for attending. I will say that this month and next month, this series embraces two of the major figures of 20th century modernism, the novelist Virginia Woolf, a Brit, and the poet, an American, T.S. Eliot. And so we kind of go out with a bang. That's a reference to an Eliot poem that we're not doing, but you may get that or you may not. I'm going to try to give 15 to 20-minute installments and pause so that you can ask questions if you like through the chat. And I just want to repeat Kate's offer that if you think of something later, or you have a question that doesn't get passed on to me, send it to my email, which she'll provide you with, and I will answer you promptly, even if the answer is I don't know. So for this first unit of the talk, I want to give you some sense of what I see as the overview of what Virginia Woolf did in Mrs. Dalloway, a novel which really changed the direction of fiction. She had read Ulysses, the 1922 novel by James Joyce, that also takes place in a single day in June in a capital, but it's Dublin. And she was upset by the fact that it was kind of trashy, and she thought too much in the gutter. She had a sensibility like Clarissa Dalloway that couldn't tolerate too much what she thought of as nitty-gritty. And so in some ways, Mrs. Dalloway is not her answer to Ulysses, but her attempts at a single day novel. So even that's remarkable and part of modernism. The modernists believe, and you're a modernist in England and America if you're born in the 19th century and you're flourishing between the two world wars. So whether it's Faulkner or Fitzgerald or Hemingway or D.H. Lawrence or Conrad, the great modernists are making their main careers between the two world wars. In fact, Virginia Woolf's novelistic career is exactly between the two world wars, and she died by suicide in 1941 at the beginning of the Second World War. So one thing that makes her a modernist is modernists believe that you didn't need to write a novel that covered months or years of a person's life. If people have character, and they do, you can show their character in a single episode or in a very short period of time. So it's a reframing of the Victorian novel's notion that you want to see a character develop over time, and you want to see he or she confront obstacles, and those obstacles test and reveal that person's character. So another reorientation is the modernist novel has lots of things that happen, but maybe nothing that you would call an event. So if you were to summarize to someone who hadn't read the novel, what happens in the novel, most of what happens is interior. So many of the memories are more important than what's happening in real time. And for my undergraduates who are new to Virginia Woolf, they're thwarted by the fact that there's no big E event that they can write about. It's too subtle and too nuanced for that. When Virginia Woolf first published the novel in 1925, she incorporated a character that she had used in some short stories, Mrs. Dalloway, where in one of those stories, she was a hostess, as she is here. And the idea of the party dominates the entire trajectory of the novel. And for some of her acquaintances who knew her, but were not intimate with her, they thought that she was poking fun at Clarissa Dalloway, because a woman of Virginia Woolf's talent and intellect couldn't possibly be serious about a 52-year-old society matron who wonders whether her party will be a success. And if you remember nothing else tonight, remember this. For Virginia Woolf, being a host of a party, I'll use the gender neutral term, is one of the most significant things that you can do. And she used it as a metaphor for writing a novel, for hosting people in a novel. And if that seems strange to you, remember that this is 1925. It's set in 1923. She started writing the novel in 1923, not long after the war, maybe long enough to start to get some distance. Many, many novels about the First World War are written in the 1920s. All Quiet on the Western Front, Farewell to Arms, this novel. There are ways in which Dubliners is a post-World War I novel, even though it's set before the war. It has the feel of civilization under ruin, which is why the author goes back to Homeric times. And even a novel like The Great Gatsby, which I had the pleasure of talking about earlier this week, is a novel where the brutality, the violence, the empty ambition is partly a carryover from the trauma of the war. So if you put yourself in the 1920s, one of the things you might be thankful for is the sanity, the simple joy of having a party. And think now, for all of us who've been living under the burden and in some cases trauma of the pandemic, how much a simple gathering would be therapeutic. And so for Virginia Woolf, she thought one of the things a novel should do is not the Victorian ideal of teaching you morality, of giving you a way to live, of being a kind of secular Bible and showing you why to be a good person is to be a successful person. She didn't believe that was true anymore in the 20th century. She thought the best a novel could do in the welter and chaos of the modern world, which by the 1920s has many major telecommunications, has suffered through the war. There are changes in psychology. There are changes in physics that are suggesting that the world is a less stable place, Einstein's relativity theory and so on. She felt that what the artist actually does is let people compose themselves and gather. And when I teach this to undergraduates, they are suspicious that being a host of a party is anything significant until I question them about how often they've been to and hosted a party. And I'll give you a simple example. A work colleague, let's think about pre-COVID, what my friends and I have come to call the before times. Before COVID, a colleague might say, you want to come over, I'm having a little get together tonight. You go home, maybe you shower, maybe you change your clothes, you bring some dip, you go to a party where most everybody you see on a regular basis, maybe there's 12 people, you hear music playing in the background that you could play if you want to, and everything that's served at the party is something you could have on your own if you wanted to, but it's a party. And even though the people you know, it has a shape, a time to come, a time to leave. It's an event, and it gives a kind of quiet sustenance to life. For Virginia Woolf, that's not only a valuable thing in the novel, her party is important, not just to Clarissa, who can be kind of frivolous, but to society. It's good to get together, and that's no more true than now when we are so often prohibited from being together. But if you add to that what an artist can do is get you, that is you, the reader, to sit still for a couple of hours and read a book and feel that you have been invited into some gathering of disparate people who seem to have a almost telepathic connection. The narration and point of view shifts from person to person, but it still has a shape. The novel has a beginning, middle, and an end. The last novel that she wrote, which was published posthumously, which along with Mrs. Dalloway is my favorite, is Between the Acts. And Between the Acts of the title of that novel refers to the fact that there is a charity theatrical show being put on the history of England on the grounds of an estate of a couple who are very wealthy but having a troubled marriage. And the conversation between people takes place between the acts of this performance, which starts in Elizabethan England and comes up to the present day. But because Virginia Woolf's career began right after the First World War, and she hoped that her novels of composition, her novels of gathering, would make a Second World War impossible, the several breakdowns that she had in her life before she was 22, the death of her mother, the death of a stepsister who was like a mother, the death of her father. Now, obviously, those deaths, even in succession, don't make you have a breakdown. She had a history from her teenage years of mental illness, which she referred to as madness. There's a kind of long British literary tradition of referring it to madness. Madness, of course, is not a diagnosis. She was terribly depressed. And for her, part of what disappointed her when she was writing Between the Acts is she actually believed naively that writing the kind of fiction that she and E.M. Forster and D.H. Lawrence and others wrote would make the world less likely to go into a Second World War. So another way to see that novel is Between the Acts of the War. So that notion that where are you between the acts? You're at an intermission. The novel takes place in a kind of intermission between two great global catastrophes. So don't underestimate how significant it is that she's a party host and that the novel begins by her declaring that she's going to buy the flowers herself. Also, in the first draft of the novel, she had intended that Clarissa would be the character who would die by suicide because she was associating herself very much with Clarissa. And there are critics who have suggested that in having Clarissa die in the original plan of the novel, she kind of exercised that she gave herself permission to live by killing off her kind of alter ego. Clarissa is 52 in the novel, and at the time that Virginia Woolf is writing it, she's only 43. But like Clarissa, she's concerned about being, quote unquote, middle-aged and nearing death. So that original draft, that original conception that had Clarissa die was called The Hours. And you may know the extraordinary novel published in 1998 by Michael Cunningham called The Hours. If you've never read it, I recommend it to you. If you only know the movie, I recommend the novel to you. The movie came out in 2002. It is a splendid reimagining of the entire trajectory of Mrs. Dalloway. It was called The Hours because that's what makes us die. The hours is what beats us down. And she wrote that first novel with the idea, that first draft, that Clarissa could not survive the passage of time, that tolling of the hours of Big Ben, that life was death. I'm fond of saying that if you imagined a kind of a fairy tale where souls before being born were offered life with a capital L, and you said, well, what does it entail exactly? Oh, it's great. You have a body, you have sensations, you can taste clementines, you can have sex, you can feel the sun on your face. Sign me up. And then you're born and you're in life, and someone says, you know, you're going to die after a while. Well, no one mentioned that to me when they gave me life. Life, you didn't get life, you got mortality. Mortality, nobody told me. It's the same word. It's like the generic brand of life. To be alive is to be mortal. Life is mortality. But we would never call a breakfast cereal mortality, or a magazine, or a board game. Life emphasizes one thing, mortality emphasizes the other. And in the split vision of this novel, Clarissa is on the side of life, which is how Virginia Woolf redeemed her, gave her life, kept her alive. And poor Septimus is on the side of death. His PTSD, shell shock, is something he cannot get over. And Virginia Woolf wrote in her notebook, she wanted to depict side by side life from the sane and the insane perspectives. And that's what we have in these two main characters who never meet, unlike the two characters in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus, who do finally meet. So she recast the novel as a celebration of life, having Clarissa Dalloway first be annoyed that the doctor has mentioned at her party that one of his patients has died of a suicide, as if he spilt red wine on a white carpet, and then going up to her room and thinking better of the fact that that young man had the courage to give away his gift, and in some ways committing herself again to the life that she has. And so she is filled with the joy of life. And I want to read you, before I turn it over to questions, that the novel opens with the famous indirectly narrated line, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And then a paragraph later, what a lark, what a plunge. For it had so always seemed to her when with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst upon the French windows and plunged at Bourton into the fresh air, her childhood home in the Cotswold. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave. So plunging into the morning, plunging into the day is like plunging into the water. The kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. And then it says later on, as she contemplates living in Westminster for as long as she has, that she would not say of anyone in the world that they were this or that. She felt very young. At a time she felt at the same time unspeakably aged. That idea of dualism, a character who is insane, a character who's sane, a character who stays alive, a character who commits suicide, her feeling young and old at the same time, is one of the hallmarks of the novel. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking in, so deeply engaged, but also standing apart. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxi cab, of being out, far out to sea and alone. And in fact, her isolation, although she's a mother and a wife and a former lover of Peter and a host of a party, one of her hallmarks is she's very isolated. And then this remarkable line, she always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Now, in the world we are now, we recognize how dangerous it is to live even one day. But it's dangerous partly because if you love life, and Clarissa does, then it's dangerous because you could lose it. And that's the beginning of the novel, this idea that it's a dangerous thing to live even one day, and that not being a lament, but a kind of cry of celebration. So I want to read one more passage before we break, saying, this is earlier in the novel, very early. She lived over 20 years in Westminster. She felt a positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense before Big Ben strikes. There, out it boomed, first a warning, musical, then the hour irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling, creating it every moment afresh. But the various frumps, the most dejected of miseries, sitting on doorsteps, she's talking about indigent women, drink their downfall, do the same, can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by acts of parliament for that very reason. They love life in people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwichmen shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead with what she loved, life, London, this moment in June. That is an absolute ecstasy, which is one of the words the novel invokes several times. And it's very urban. What I just described to you is a street scene with the vehicles and the paraphernalia of a street scene. Never forget that that's Mrs. Dalloway's instincts as she walks out even 20 years in Westminster. She is a lover of life who also recognizes that it's a dangerous thing to live even one day, that life means mortality, and who is very self-conscious that she's getting older. And now I'll break for Kate to feed me questions.
We do have a couple of questions, so Rick, take it away.
I will. And Mr. Mark, we have a question that asks about bringing in Virginia Woolf's life to the story. And they acknowledge, let me read it, it's a couple lines. If I remember correctly, you have told us that we know only what is in the story. But outside the story, we know what Virginia Woolf was. She was the seventh child, seems to have suffered mental illness, perhaps PTSD herself, loss of family members, and then died by suicide. Are we permitted then to bring what we know about her to our understanding and interpretation of the Septimus character?
Yeah, so when you say permitted, I don't have the rule book. I have no whistle. I'm not the referee. I am fond of saying more is more. So if you know a lot about Virginia Woolf, if you know more than that she herself had longings for women, that she was almost certainly a victim of abuse by her half siblings, her brothers. If you know more, you know more. The reason I caution about bringing autobiographical or biographical information into a novel is not that it's not okay to do it. For many people, it doesn't let them appreciate the novel as it's written. So someone who would hear a litany, and it's certainly a litany, of the several breakdowns that Virginia Woolf had, the incidents that I just referred to briefly, the fact that she killed herself in order to avoid another bout of madness, put on an overcoat, loaded the pockets with heavy rocks, and walked into the neighborhood river, you would read this novel very differently and maybe miss what I just read aloud, which is this hymn to a glorious day in June. She is filled with love, she is filled with life, but she also realizes the downside. So my suggestion always is, if you know more about an author, use it any way you want. But I caution people, especially my students, not to run to Wikipedia, not to read books by the light of the author's life, when there's so much in the book to pay attention to.
Thank you. And we have one last question. Was Clarissa confident in party preparations, as Virginia Woolf may have been confident in manuscript preparations?
Yeah, I don't think it's a manuscript preparation so much as conceiving of a novel as bringing people together. So referring again to that last novel, Between the Acts, written just before she died and published right after, when she does the present day, when the woman who is the stage director of this festival pageant of the history of England comes to the present day ourselves, that is in 1940, she has all the characters go into the manor house and bring out every kind of reflecting glass, long mirrors and hand mirrors, and they stand on the grass facing the audience who see themselves in the mirrors. And the narrator says they were all disconnected, that is in fragments. It's not a big sheet of glass. They catch disconnected images of themselves. But the narrator says, but at any rate, composed and sitting still. And that's Virginia Woolf's hope, that by inviting people in, they may be different people in different sensibilities and fractured, but for the moment, they're sitting still. One of the things about Septimus is he cannot find peace. He's insanely haunted by a dead man, Evans, and doesn't know how to process that. Clarissa is going to be sanely haunted by a dead man, Septimus, and she's able to work it through, what we now call processing, the difference between someone who is sane and someone who's not. Virginia Woolf felt that in the post-war period, people needed to compose. In fact, I'll say this, one of the colloquial expressions that I believe strongly in, especially having spent more than 30 years teaching undergraduates, is the idea of pulling yourself together. That people who feel that they're spreading themselves too thin or they're falling apart, all of those colloquial expressions for that idea that, pull yourself together, man. That idea that when you're happiest, you feel composed, not necessarily successful, not necessarily even happy or rich, but you feel centered. That's another word people use. She felt that the novelist offered readers a chance to be centered.
And one last question that came in from Claudine. Is it widely considered that creating Septimus and having him as the character who commits suicide enhanced the novel as Virginia Woolf's original imagining?
I don't know what's widely accepted. I confess I don't have that kind of broad reference, but I think it's clear that she put Septimus in the novel to make him the person who bears the weight of mortality. And this poor shell-shocked soldier whose wife is desperately in love with him is not going to survive his trauma. And he makes a different kind of plunge, intentionally punning on Clarissa's celebration of the plunge into water, the plunge into life, the plunge into this remarkably beautiful June day. He plunges in a different way. It's as if having him die allows Clarissa to live, and maybe in the complicated psychology of the author, allowed her to live as well. So having given that overview, and in the hour that I have total, I can't possibly cover everything in the novel, so I'm going to try to hit the high points. The next thing is some of the themes, and one is the love of life, which I already mentioned. Another is the idea of the trauma of the First World War. And I want to say again, this is very powerful, that a lot of the novels of the 1920s, whether some of the ones I mentioned that can be seen as post-World War I novels or not, are a way of trying to get sort of sanity back. And by the end of the decade, the kind of exuberance of the Roaring Twenties, or what F. Scott Fitzgerald, he didn't coin the term, but he popularized it, called the Jazz Age, had a kind of freneticism of people kind of dancing on the edge of a cliff. And you know what happened after the Roaring Twenties, the Depression. There's this sense that the First World War has to be processed in the novel, and that one of the enemies of life, and one of the facets of life is time, is the hours. If you know the great Faulkner novel, The Sound and the Fury, Quentin, who winds up committing suicide, is plagued by the notion of time. He says to himself in the novel, it was time that crucified Christ. That is, by becoming a mortal person, that he was killed. And so time here is both a marker of mortality and the only way you can live. There are also references to feminism, to implicit homosexuality as a kind of burgeoning sense in Virginia Woolf's mind and art, that there are many kinds of people. There's another thing that's so striking about the novel, and that, of course, is its style. I've already mentioned the modernist belief that you can show a character's inner workings without referencing an entire plot of winding up getting married or solving a problem or getting a fortune. She said in an essay that she wrote in 1924, so between beginning this novel and publishing it, she wrote an essay called Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. If you have an interest in knowing more about Virginia Woolf, reading that essay would be a better next step than even reading another of her many good novels. Mr. Bennet is Arnold Bennett, one of the naturalists of the end of the 19th century. That is a writer who thought that you best depicted people as sociological beings with a socioeconomic class, and they were who they were because of this station. He would put other people, she would put other people in that category, including Galsworthy and H.G. Wells, men who wrote about society and social status. And the Mrs. Brown of the title, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, is an average woman reader, you know, like Jane Q. Public. And in the essay, she says that when Mr. Bennet goes into detail, Arnold Bennett, the novelist, about how many buttons a coachman has on his sleeve, what does that have anything to do with the interior life of Mrs. Brown? These novels about society, about the veneer, about the socioeconomic status of people in the real world, does not speak to what human beings, especially female human beings, need. That's why the character in The Hours, the novel by Michael Cunningham, who leaves her son to go to a hotel room to think about taking her own life, and she doesn't go to a hotel room to sleep with a lover. She goes to the hotel room to read Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is keeping her connected to life. Mrs. Dalloway, reading it, gives her the courage to leave her family. If you think that's a spoiler, there's so much more going on in that novel. That's why Michael Cunningham called that character Mrs. Brown. And Virginia Woolf says there has to be a new kind of literature that speaks to Mrs. Brown, because she said famously in that essay, on or around December 1910, human character changed. What happened in December 1910 is there was a great exhibit in London of post-impressionism. Manet, Seurat, Van Gogh, Cézanne, all of these post-impressionistic painters turning away from naturalism and writing and painting a different kind of emotional, exuberant art. And Virginia Woolf said that we are starting to think of people differently. If we think of people differently, we have to create them in our art, not just our painting, but our literature differently. And so she's interested in presenting people who think about the past as if they're still in it. Very common in Fitzgerald. The past is not the past, he said. And who have a continual sense of the impressions that are working in their lives, that are impinging upon them all the time. She called it the tunneling sense. So I want to find this quote that I want to read to you. She says that each fresh reading of a classic author, one notices some change in the book, as if the sap of life ran in their leaves, and with skies and plants, they have the power to alter their shape and color from season to season. To write down one's impressions of Hamlet, one reads it year after year, would be virtually to record one's own autobiography. For as we know more of life, so Shakespeare's comments upon what we know. That is, we are always in flux, and our character is not one thing and any more stable than a fictional character. So we have to give fictional beings the same credit to a chaotic that is a life full of flux. And again, for many readers, especially readers who aren't used to reading modernism, by now, this novel of nearly 100 years old is old news. But for people whose hallmark is reading literary fiction that is conventionally narrated, conventionally plotted, it puzzles them about the jumping around of the point of view. But think about even those of you who are strictly paying attention to me, thank you for that, in this half hour or so, think about how often something has come into your mind that's a kind of digression or a kind of daydream. And think about, I'm sure you've done this little exercise as often as I have, where you're driving and all of a sudden you're thinking about your grandmother and you try to work backwards for how you got from wherever you were to your grandmother, and you don't realize you passed a billboard with a picture of someone who out of the corner of your eye looks a little bit like your grandmother, and it's happening to you without you realizing it. So the real glory of the novel is this sense that character is not something stable and fixed or conventional. It's constantly in flux, and it's informed by an interior life that is marked by a relatively new fictional technique called stream of consciousness. Now, I'm sure everyone in this Zoom room or this webinar room has heard that term, but like all literary conventions, it's an artistic attempt to recreate something about a life. So stream of consciousness, which dates from the late 19th century, is the attempt to render this sort of connected disconnectedness of the interior life. And if you actually were able to write down 10 minutes worth of impressions, it would be utter chaos. You couldn't comprehend it. And so people like Joyce, who is more stream-like, more chaotic, or Woolf, who's a little bit more straightforward, try to duplicate in their prose this experience of things happening all the time, making connections without even realizing it, having an interior life that is as full as actual life, even when you're doing nothing. So for Virginia Woolf, the party that Clarissa organizes, I think of it as a gathering, has its own value. And even without it, throughout the entire novel, short novel, she has been gathering impressions about her past, about Sally, about her school days, about her childhood, about her daughter, about her husband, about Peter, in the way we all do all the time. And for most people, that impressionism is what makes the novel so distinctive, that makes Mrs. Dalloway, the novel, so distinctive. And now I'll pause again, since I think we're at the 2/3 mark.
I don't see any more questions, Mark, so I think you may continue.
Okay, the novel makes reference to the fact that she's been called the perfect hostess. And later in the novel, and I know I don't have your edition, if you happen to have the very old-fashioned edition that's published by, I'll tell you in a second, Harcourt, Brace and World, it's at the bottom of 247. But it talks about Peter, who's playing with his penknife constantly in a kind of masculine self-centeredness, maybe a little bit of compensation. He says that right now he's starting to go to a party at his age with the belief upon him that he was about to have an experience. But what, says the narrator, this party that he's going to, what's actually going to happen there. He has come to arrange a divorce for a much younger woman he's going to marry. It's clear to him that for him, the loss of, or the never gaining fully the love or the hand of Clarissa has been a formative event in his life, something he's never gotten over. And he feels a kind of terror and ecstasy at the notion that he's coming to the party. Now, if this were a more conventional novel, something would be resolved at the end. And again, my students, and I don't mock them for this, I'm very sympathetic to this, they're confounded by not knowing exactly what to do with the end of the novel. And in 10 minutes or so, when I'm at the end of my talk, I'll mention how I see that happening. But when she thinks about the death coming into her party as something awful, there in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. Again, it's a kind of faux pas. And then she realizes that why had he committed this act? And there's a part of her, certainly there's a strong part of Virginia Woolf, who sympathizes with the idea that he had plunged holding his treasure. That's on page 281, that notion of plunging again. And she walks to the window and she looks out, part of the curtains, and in the room opposite, the old lady stared straight at her. They're living, of course, in London, maybe in a brownstone, not in some country mansion where your nearest neighbor is miles away. In the room opposite, the old lady stared at her. She was going to bed. And the sky, it will be a solemn sky, she had thought. It will be a dusky sky, turning away its cheek and beauty. But there it was, ashen pale, raced over quickly by tapering vast clouds. That is, she's looking beyond herself. She may have a room of her own, to pun on another work by Virginia Woolf, but what she has to learn when she goes upstairs, being upset that her party has been ruined, in her view, by a doctor just mentioning that his patient committed suicide. It's not like the ambulance has come to her door. What she has to learn is to get out of her own way. She has to learn to stop contemplating her own navel. When she says she will get the flowers herself, there's an element of self-satisfaction in that. If the party means anything, it means more than just what it means to Clarissa. So it's important that she looks at someone else who's in a room of her own. It's important that she looks up at the sky. And then it's important that she consider this woman who she calls an old lady. It was fascinating to watch her moving about, that old lady, crossing the room, coming to the window. Could she see her? So the two women are both at the window, looking out and possibly at each other. It was fascinating, with people still laughing and shouting in the drawing room, to watch that old woman quite quietly going to bed. She pulled the blind now. The clock began striking. That is, there's still time. Time is still a problem. The young man had killed himself, but she did not pity him. With the clock striking the hour 1, 2, 3, she did not pity him with all this going on. There, the old lady had put out her light. The whole house was dark now. She repeated, and the words came to her, "Fear no more the heat of the sun." That is, when you're dead, you don't have to worry about decay. She must go back to them, to the party. But what an extraordinary night. She felt something very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. The clock was striking. Now, when I want to say she felt glad that he did it, she's not aiding a suicide. Suicide's a terrible thing. She herself died of suicide. He has already committed suicide, and she is approving the kind of courage, but she doesn't pity him. It says rather that she felt something very like him. That's very different. When you pity someone, you're on the outside of them. But when you empathize with someone, you're feeling with them. It's the difference between sympathy and empathy. And for this moment, and it's very brief, it's what Joyce would call an epiphany, She's gotten out of her own way. She contemplated the sky, the moving clouds, the fact that there's another woman, an old woman across the way. Other people exist. And she goes back to her party with that new sense, very subtle, that life is more complicated than she thought it was earlier. And certainly she no longer carries the sense that this news has ruined her party. So when she goes downstairs, we're told that Sally and Peter are talking, and that they look over and see Elizabeth. And this is Peter talking. There's Elizabeth, he said, that is Clarissa and Richard's daughter. She feels not half what we feel, not yet. But, said Sally, watching Elizabeth go to her father, one can see they are devoted to each other. She could feel it by the way Elizabeth went to her father. For her father had been looking at her. That is the kind of thing you do at a party. He's not talking to her. He didn't call her over. He's looking at her as he stood talking to the Bradshaws. That's the doctor and his wife. And he had thought to himself, who is that lovely girl? And suddenly he realized, that's another epiphany, sudden realization, that it was his Elizabeth. And he had not recognized her. She looked so lovely in her pink frock. That's because she's made a decision about her life and avoiding a kind of potential abuse situation from a teacher. She's a new woman, even though she's young. Elizabeth had felt him looking at her as she talked to Willie Titcomb. And all of this is being watched by Sally and Peter, the kind of thing a party makes possible. She went to him and they stood together. Again, neither of them called for each other, but one was watching and the other one realized they were watching. They now composed themselves together. Now that the party was almost over, looking at the people going and the rooms getting emptier and emptier with things scattered on the floor. And then it mentions a number of people. And then it says, Sally says, Richard has improved, you're right. I shall go and talk to him. I shall say goodnight. What does the brain matter, says one character, compared to the heart? I will come, said Peter, but he sat on for a moment. That is, he'll leave with her, this woman. And then he says, he thinks, what is this terror? What is this ecstasy? He thought to himself. And that terror, that ecstasy, that absolute opposition, like feeling very young and feeling very old, like being too much in your own way and actually being empathetic with other people, with looking at your daughter as herself and not imagining her as you see her, with being aware that life is a gift and also a risk. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy? He thought to himself. What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? The excitement of terror, the excitement of ecstasy. It's why people ride roller coasters or go to horror movies. It is Clarissa, he said, for there she was. That is, she's just nearby him, the way Elizabeth was near her father, the way people are near other people at a party. And if you are a family member of any kind, whether you're a parent or not, everyone in this webinar room has felt the absolute joy of being in the presence of someone you love deeply. Often it is a blood relation or a marital relation, but of course it can be a great friend. It's just enough to be in their presence. I'm blessed to be a grandfather for the first time of a 19-month-old girl whose most of whose life has been COVID, but because we're careful and tested and vaccinated and she lives nearby, I get to see her quite often. It's enough that she's just there. And for that moment, this man fiddling with his penknife and thinking about India and England and regrets about what might have been, he has a moment of composure where he feels this extraordinary excitement. Why is it a terror? Because it's a dangerous thing to live even one day. If you recognize that life can bring you that kind of excitement, it can also take it away. And why this ecstasy? What does an ecstasy mean literally? It's an out-of-body experience. It's something beyond sex. It's beyond physicality. It has nothing to do with that puny penknife. What is it? It is Clarissa, he said, for there she was. And that's the last line of the novel, much to the chagrin of my poor undergraduates, at least some of them. That is, he sees her now clearly, which is what her name means. The clarity of Clarissa just being there because he came to her party. And when he says earlier, he thinks something's going to happen, but what? What happens is this. It doesn't happen in the sense of some event, some important conversation, some dramatic kiss or touch on the shoulder. He recognizes that what completes him for the moment, they're not running off together, is that there she was. And she gets a kind of quiet grandeur from this notion of completion, this relationship that's not sexual, not romantic, not even male-female in the conventional sense, because she has come back down. And just as Richard sees his daughter Elizabeth with new eyes, she seems a different person because she's extracted herself from an unhealthy relationship. Clarissa comes down probably with a new vitality that he doesn't even see, but feels in the present. It's a glorious, almost supernatural celebration of what life makes possible. And I'll use that to make my last comment, which is for a number of these writers, including Joyce, one of the things they're trying to do in these novels is find in a secular way, in a socially realistic way, some of the satisfaction that people used to get from religion or faith. One of the things that these writers are doing, consciously or unconsciously, is they're trying to find a kind of divinity or spirituality in everyday life. For D.H. Lawrence, it was sex, not sex in just the physical act, but the reverent notion, the biological notion of procreation and intercourse as a celebration of life. And for many of the writers of the modernist period, in the absence of religion, they're trying to find something that takes its place. When we turn next time to T.S. Eliot, he very atypically is a deeply religious man. So he's not looking for something himself in the place of religion. He's looking at what's happened to religion in a fallen world. And so now I'll stop with a few minutes left to our hour, and I'm happy to take questions if you have them.
Yes, Mark, we do have one question. Can you speak a bit to the character of Elizabeth and Miss Killman? Is Miss Killman angry because of her lot in life, or is she having feelings for Elizabeth? I was confused about their dynamic and whether or not Clarissa has any notion of the nature of their relationship.
Yeah, so you'll have to excuse me. I don't remember well enough whether Clarissa has a sense of it, but it's certainly true that for Elizabeth, this sexual attention from not only someone who's older, but a teacher, puts her in a position of potentially being abused. And by the end of the novel, Elizabeth has kind of thrown that over. She's not really being haunted by Miss Killman, but she's being burdened by her in the same way that in a much quicker time frame, Clarissa, who'd been burdened by the thought of the suicide, kind of exercises him in a positive way, not just by forgetting him or pushing him aside, but for thinking they have something in common. She kind of domesticates the terror of him. And so I think Elizabeth has a kind of success in the story. And of course, Virginia Woolf in her own life, and Clarissa earlier in her life, having kissed a female, there's this suggestion of something that has the sort of sensationalism of it not quite being okay, something fondly remembered by Clarissa, but something quite different when she thinks about her daughter. I think Elizabeth is an interesting character in the book, and I think it matters enormously in the Richard-Clarissa relationship that they have this daughter who is much closer to the father and much more stable like the father than she is like her mother. In the novel, The Hours, there are two other characters. One of them is Virginia Woolf herself. So part of the novel gives attention to the historical Virginia Woolf writing Mrs. Dalloway and other novels. And the other character is a kind of Earth Mother figure living in Greenwich Village in the 80s, who is named Clarissa, and who is a kind of modern day incarnation of this hero. And so in the three characters of the hours, which I really do strongly recommend to you, one of them is the person who wrote the book, one of them is a version of the character in the book, and the third is somebody reading the book, just what you need for a work of art, someone to make it to be about somebody, and somebody to read it. I want to say also that if you're new to Virginia Woolf, and I'm sure many of you are not, but when I'm talking to a group of how many people do we have, Kate?
We have 16.
Yes. So I'm talking to a seminar size group of people. I can't know, even if I could see you and read your body language, how many of you are Virginia Woolf aficionados or experts and how many not. But if you haven't read Virginia Woolf and you want a novel to read after this, I strongly recommend the book she wrote after this, To the Lighthouse, another contender for masterpiece, absolutely. And even more than this book, with lots of autobiographical information about her own childhood. The Ramseys are a fictional representation of her own family. And it's a beautiful book in two parts, divided by the World War, and very impressionistic, even more so than this. I recommend that to you as a next stop if you haven't read it. And if you continue to admire and appreciate Virginia Woolf, there are many more novels and essays you can read. She was really a remarkably prolific and brilliant figure. And I continue to think of Mrs. Dalloway as one of the best novels of the 20th century. It's also a novel much loved by writers. Recently, in the book review, a translator mentioned about how much she loved Mrs. Dalloway. The New Yorker at the end of last year had a praise of Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway by a woman who wrote the introduction to the new Penguin edition of the novel that came out this January. It's a novel that never gets old.
Yeah. Can you please talk more about Virginia's spirituality and how it is expressed in her novel?
Yeah. So no, I can't talk much, and not just because we're nearly out of time. And I don't say this out of any disrespect for the questioner. It's not spirituality in the sense of redirected religion. If you read for yourself again that passage where she's just intoxicated by the hum of life that is so forceful, noisy, exuberant, that even the women who have been besotted by drink must feel it. That's the spirituality, the spirit of spirituality, that sense of enthusiasm. And the word enthusiasm has thus in the middle. That thus is God. That's theos. That's Zeus. To be enthusiastic, the root of the word is to be filled with God. And you know that there was a turn of the century from the 18th to the 19th century, a kind of turning away from empty rationalism in the view of these people and trying to find the emotionalism of romanticism in a new kind of celebration of spirit. And those were the enthusiasts. Those were the people who believed that religion should not be a puritanical sense of giving things up, but a celebration of the zest of life. That's what I mean by spirituality, a kind of love of life on its own terms. The Romantics redirected the celebration of a spirit in the world from looking up into the heavens and not knowing who is on the other side to finding the satisfaction in the natural world, in the world of daisies and daffodils. And maybe I can make this my closing line for this talk, because Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway are very much on the continuum with Romanticism. Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish historian who wrote an epic study of the French Revolution, I recommend it to you if you have 3 or 4 months with nothing to do. He said that in the age of belief, in the biblical age, the age of Homer, the age of the Old Testament, the age of the New Testament, people wanted to believe, really believe in the invisible. And he gave the example of Christ in the parable, or not parable if you believe it, actually turning water into wine at the marriage feast of Cana, reportedly his first public miracle. So he said what happened in the age of belief is people were able to look at everyday things and invest them with a kind of enthusiasm. Water becomes wine. And then Carlyle said in the Enlightenment, the scientists came along and they did a chemical analysis of wine, and they'll tell you that it's water, that wine is mainly water. And what they did was they reversed the process and they took the spirit, the enthusiasm, the value out of life, and they made it elemental. They made it empirical. And he said what the 19th century was doing is they're trying to find a way to keep the spirituality of people who believed in the invisible for an age that doesn't believe in the invisible anymore. People who don't think that they're going to heaven. George Eliot, the great Victorian writer, said the prayer of the average Englishman, she said Englishman, was, "Dear God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul." He said what the Romantics did is they looked at water and they turned it into water. Oh my, water, look, oh, daffodils, rainbows, lambs, little children. That is, they took the everyday things of life and they treated it with a kind of reverence, the way that Clarissa does in the opening pages of this novel, before she gets caught up in mortality and worried about everyday life and worry about the party. And we know she composes herself again when we're up there in the room. And we know especially that she's composed because Peter feels it just by her being nearby. Miraculous. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
It was a pleasure, and I hope to see all of you here on April 22nd when Mark will be talking about T.S. Eliot.
And could I urge you to read those poems out loud, especially Prufrock, which is actually a dramatic monologue. I want to urge you, as I do with all poems, but especially Prufrock, well, actually both of them are monologues, someone talking out loud. I want to urge you to read those poems out loud if you can. And for those of you celebrating between now and then, happy Passover, happy Easter, and I'll see you on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mark. Thank you for our wonderful attendees, and we'll see you in April.